Forza Motorsport has been one of the most successful and highly acclaimed Xbox exclusives, alongside Halo and Gears of War. Forza Motorsport 3 and 4 marked a turning point in the racing genre, as they critically outperformed Gran Turismo, despite not selling as many copies as Gran Turismo 5 and its prologue. The franchise also spawned an open-world spin-off called Forza Horizon, but with the release of the Xbox One, a new era of gaming had begun. In May 2013, Microsoft announced its third-generation console, which featured several launch titles including Assassin's Creed Black Flag, Battlefield 4, and Need for Speed Rivals. However, it was Forza Motorsport 5 that caught the attention of many racing gamers, including myself. Although it piqued my interest over a decade ago upon its announcement, I played the game for the first time fairly recently, specifically for this review. Consequently, I do not have access to any of the game's downloadable content, which has since been delisted for licensing reasons. Forza Motorsport 5 was released on the 22nd of November 2013, alongside the launch of the Xbox One. Just like Forza Motorsport 3 and 4, you have to drive the cover car as an introduction to the game, but before you do that, you have to get in it. I think that was to showcase the Auto Vista feature, which actually has nothing to do with the racing whatsoever, and getting into the McLaren P1 by yourself seems a bit pointless, as you don't do that for the rest of the game, unless you go into the Auto Vista feature in the menu. I get why the developers did this, but I do think it's a waste of time, not just getting into the car, but doing the whole tutorial race in general. All I want to do is get into the game, and most of the game's player base probably would agree with me on that. I suppose it does help new players, but there needs to be a skip tutorial option. I feel the same way about all of the Forza Motorsport games from 3 onwards. It's fine with the Horizon games, as it introduces the story and a few of the characters, but in the Motorsport games, it's mainly to help new players find the right settings for their skill level and to show you how good the graphics are. But that's pointless, as you'll see how good the graphics are when you get into the career mode. Forza Motorsport 5's career mode is split up into 8 leagues, and those leagues have between 3 and 7 championships, all with varying lengths. You no longer start the game with a small low-powered hatchback and do beginner events that consist of 3 or 4 races. Now you get given a relatively high-powered car and start a championship that can take over an hour to complete, and this is where the game starts to properly go wrong. Nobody asked for this. The majority of us were happy with the way that it had been done in the first 4 games, especially 3 and 4, and the way that the career mode is structured in this game makes it really repetitive from the start. The developers did find ways to make it less repetitive by adding other types of events that are placed throughout each championship, but to make it less repetitive, all they needed to do was reduce the number of races. You have other types of events that were also in Forza Motorsport 4, such as bowling, track days, autocross, and a few others. I won't go into detail about them, as I've explained what they are in my Forza Motorsport 4 review. But the developers added the Top Gear London Challenge and Stig's Digital Cousin Challenge. The Top Gear London Challenge is a race around the Top Gear test track, and that doesn't sound that exciting. But there are large 2D London landmarks, such as Big Ben, the London Eye, Tower Bridge, and a lot of London buses placed on the outside of the track limits. There are also obstacles on the track like post boxes, wheelie bins, and traffic barriers, which all go flying when you drive through them. I like the idea of this, but I think it would have been better to have a London city circuit instead of a track based 44 miles away. The other new race type, Stig's Digital Cousin Challenge, is just a short one-on-one race against a car that is closely matched with your car. There's nothing special about it. They do stop the game from getting too repetitive, but you don't earn as much for doing them compared to a normal race, as they don't take as long to complete. One of the very few things that I do like about the game is when you enter a new championship, either Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond, or James May will talk about the class of car that you'll be racing. They give you a little bit of the history and the occasional reference to Top Gear.
There's the Volkswagen Scirocco. VW doesn't like to call it a hatch, but nor is it a coupe either. Still, it would be such a shame to leave it out. Especially as I wrote rather a nice song about the diesel version. I could sing it for you if you like.
They were still on the show when the game was released, but this would be the last time Jeremy would lend his voice to the Forza franchise, due to a slight altercation over cold meat in 2014, which led to him being fired by the BBC. The game uses Top Gear too much. It's almost as if they're trying to make a Top Gear game. I'm not a fan of the career mode at all. Championships go on for way too long, even the ones right at the beginning of the game, yet the career mode as a whole isn't that long for a franchise that had a 2-year release cycle. You still get the races for each class of car and car type, but there are no one model, one manufacturer, or manufacturer versus manufacturer events, which made up a large majority of the previous 2 games. Thankfully, there are a few things that the developers got absolutely perfect, such as the leveling up system. The leveling up system returns from the 4th game. It has been in the series from the start, but in Forza Motorsport 5 it's a perfect continuation and improvement on Forza 4's leveling up system. You still go up a level every now and then like you do in all the previous Forza games, but you don't get a car. Instead you get 35,000 credits. I think the developers only chose to do it that way as the game was released with only about 200 cars, and giving the player a car every time they level up will mean collecting a quarter of the car list without buying anything. This also means that you need to think a little bit more about what order you're going to do events in, as you now have to buy every car that you race, which means saving up for the higher end cars. This wasn't a thing in the 4th game, as you could just get to level 50, win a load of cars that cost over 1 million credits, and then just use them for the races. So I do think that the leveling up system in this game is better than that of its predecessor. The affinity levels also return. This is where you go up a level with a car manufacturer as you drive their cars more and more, but it is very different to how it was in the 4th game. Every time you go up an affinity level, you get a small increase in earnings at the end of a race. This is a lot better than giving the player 100% off upgrades and a, quite frankly, large amount of credits past level 5. It means that you can no longer make one of the fastest cars in the game for little to no money, and so overall, there was a lot of improvement to the progression in this aspect. It is the same with the Drivertar system. Forza Motorsport 5 was the first Forza game to use the Drivertar system as we know it today. This improves the AI massively, as all of the cars on track will drive the way a real player would drive, and at some point there must have been a huge downgrade in the quality of the player base's driving abilities. It is nothing like a modern online Forza lobby, as there's no ramming, no wall riding, and no pit maneuvering. But it's not perfect. The Drivertar AI do seem to find it hard to drive properly on tight courses, such as Miami Beach, especially on turn 1. The physics and graphics were also something that was an upgrade over the 4th game. That's not really saying much, as Forza 4 and 5 are in 2 different console generations. Turn 10 Studios made a new physics engine for this game, which allows the car to appear more realistic. The way they accelerate and brake is closer to that of a real car than any Forza game before. Suspension characteristics and driving aids were also more realistic. With the revised driving aids, it's now a lot easier to lock up your brakes and overshoot a corner or spin your car. Speaking of cars, they look amazing. There might not be as many of them as there were in the 4th game, but a lot of attention to detail went into making almost every single car asset in the game. Obviously, with the base Xbox One being around 8 times more powerful than its predecessor, it wouldn't be very hard to make a game that looked better than a game from the previous generation, but it's how they did it, which is interesting. The developers lied about the car assets being made for the game. A lot of them actually came from Forza Motorsport 2, 3, 4 and the first Horizon, but they were slightly reworked. The developers focused on lighting and how it reflects off the car's paint. For this to be done successfully, the assets had to have 3 texture layers. 2 of those layers were the car's paint and the tiny metallic flecks in the paint. This is something that the Xbox 360 would not be able to do. To be honest, I do think a lot more could have been done other than new textures. As has been pointed out by a lot of people, there are quite a few inaccuracies with the car models regarding the shapes, which is more noticeable on the Xbox One due to the higher fidelity and graphics over the 360. Luckily, this isn't a problem with the track selection. Forza Motorsport 5 has tracks in 17 locations, most of which are new to the series, such as Spa, Prague, Yas Marina and Mount Panorama, but you do also have some locations which have been in the series before, like Road Atlanta, Silverstone and Sebring International Raceway. There are a few iconic tracks from Forza's past missing, like Fujimi Kaido, Suzuka and the fictional track Maple Valley, but you do get Bernese Alps, a fictional track based in Switzerland which was introduced in Forza Motorsport 4. I didn't mention this in my review of Forza 4, but it is a bit weird basing your track in a country that had a motorsport ban in place for 67 years, a ban that was still in place at the time of the game's release. The lack of tracks is disappointing, but the tracks that the game does have look amazing, and I do feel the same way about the cars as well, but there's a bit more to it than that. As I've already mentioned, at launch Forza Motorsport 5 had 200 cars, and then another 80 or so with DLC, but if you started playing the game after it was delisted in 2017 like I did, then you're stuck with those 200 cars from launch. And even though that is about half of what the previous game had, it would be fine, but those cars still appear in the game either as opponents in races, or in the buy car menu, which means they're still in the game's files. All Forza games do this, but it's more of an issue with the 5th game, as about 33% of the cars are DLC. There are cars that were DLC in the previous 2 Forza games, such as the Ford Transit and GMC Vandura. There are also cars that were in Forza Motorsport 4 and the first Horizon, which weren't DLC in those games but are DLC in this game, like the Ferrari FF, Ford Sierra Cosworth RS500, Jaguar D-Type, Lancia Stratos and the Radical SR8 RX. Not only that, there are also cars that had been in the series from the start being sold as DLC, such as the 1994 Nissan Fairlady Z, Mitsubishi GTO and the Acura RSX. It is a bit difficult to figure out the problem, as vehicle licensing in video games is very complicated. If the car has been in the series before and the manufacturer who made the car is already in the game, I can't see how it's a licensing issue. The licensing for some cars may have needed more negotiating, but I think a lot of the cars that were in the previous base games probably didn't need extra negotiating. It's hard to imagine Ford demanding more money for the use of the Sierra Cosworth RS500, or Nissan wanting more for the use of the 90s Fairlady. There is a good variety in the 200 cars that are in the base game. You have a few small lowish powered hatchbacks such as the Ford Fiesta ST, Honda Civic and Volkswagen Golf, to supercars, hypercars and GT cars that were brand new at the time of the game's release, like the Pagani Huayra, McLaren P1 and the Ferrari F12 Berlinetta. IndyCar and Formula 1 had finally been introduced to the series with the Dallara DW12, Lotus E21, Ferrari 312 T2 and the McLaren M23. As I've already said, the car assets look good, especially when you realise that a lot of them weren't made for this game. There was a lot of attention to detail that had gone into making them, but for the Xbox 360 generation of Forza games. Just like every Forza game before this one, you can also upgrade and customize your car. It is for the most part the same as it was in Forza Motorsport 4, which I thought was pretty much perfect, and I won't go into much detail as I've already stated a large majority of it in my previous reviews. But the conversion stuff is a little bit different as you can now swap engines from other manufacturers, so doing stuff like an LS swap on a Mazda MX-5 is now possible. This means that you can now have more interesting car builds, which is always a good thing. Another thing that I like is the tuning, which is also unchanged from the previous game, but now your car's stats are updated straight away in the tuning menu, which makes it a lot easier and quicker to create the tuning setup that you want. And then we have the customization. Turn 10 Studios added camo, wood grain effect and chrome in the paint options, which were becoming more popular in real life with people adding camo and chrome wraps to their cars. Overall, the upgrading and customization is one of the few things that Forza Motorsport 5 does better than its predecessors. I went into playing this game knowing that the majority of the Forza player base hates it, but I wanted to give it a chance as I know with every single game, no matter how bad it is, there is always something that no other game has. And even though there are quite a few things that this game does better than its predecessors, it was only made to show what the Xbox One was capable of. And if it wasn't a follow-up to one of the greatest racing games of all time, a launch title for the Xbox One, and if it wasn't the only racing game on that generation Xbox at the time, apart from Need for Speed Rivals, then I think it would have killed off the Forza Motorsport series. It's not the developers' fault though, as they only had 8 months to develop the game, whilst also having to learn the new hardware. I think one of the main issues with this game was Microsoft Studios wanting quality over quantity, and normally that should be the way to do it. But it is a bit of a take when about 33% of your game is updates and paid DLC. As I was thinking about that, I realised the same thing happened 2 console generations before on the PlayStation 2 with Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, where it was the first game in its series on a new console and having way less content than its predecessor. But whilst that is highly regarded by racing game players as one of the best racing games of all time, Forza Motorsport 5 is one of the worst. But why? I think it's because it's too repetitive. That is an issue that the older Forza games have, but only when you get into the later parts of those games where the races get longer. Forza Motorsport 5 is repetitive from the start, and that is the worst part about this game. For some reason, the developers got it into their heads that people don't want to drive 70 brake horsepower cars in short races, but if you look at the best racing games, such as Gran Turismo 2, 3 and 4, Forza Motorsport 2, 3 and 4, and Need for Speed Underground, Underground 2 and Most Wanted, along with many, many others, you'll see that they all have you start off in slow cars. Not a 357 brake horsepower Audi RS3 Sportback that the game upgraded for you because it likes to have every car as closely matched as possible. I really don't recommend Forza Motorsport 5, and the £8 I paid for it was about £6 more than it should be worth. I like the inclusion of Clarkson, Hammond and May, the levelling up system, the Drivertar system, the physics, the graphics, and the car upgrading and customization, but that doesn't balance the things that I don't like, such as the repetitiveness, the game shoving a third of its unavailable content in your face at any chance it can get, and the career not being long enough. If they had added a lot more events and removed the unbought DLC when the game was delisted, then it would have been much, much better. This has been my review of Forza Motorsport 5 for the Xbox One. I know that I was very negative about the game, but I genuinely wanted to give it a chance and did not like it. If you like this review, then give it a like. If you didn't, then that's your problem, and if you want to see more, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.